House Republicans announced members to the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the federal government yesterday, including Representatives Jim Jordan as chairman, Darrell Issa, Elise Stefanik, and more. In a statement, Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy said the government has a responsibility to serve the American people, not go after them. Unfortunately, throughout Democrats' one-party rule in Washington, we saw a dangerous pattern of the government being used to target political opponents while they neglected their most basic responsibilities. All this to which Twitter CEO Elon Musk responded, "This is important."
Here to discuss is 2020 Democratic presidential nominee and acclaimed author Marianne Williamson. Welcome back to the podcast, Marianne.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, I think with maybe a few exceptions, the broad kind of liberal consensus on this is that it's Republicans not wanting the FBI, these kinds of organizations, to hold Trump and his affiliates accountable for transgressions that happened during his term as president of the United States. Obviously, Republicans say that these institutions have become weaponized for political ends. And it's difficult to find many people on the left who will say, well, look, maybe Republicans are self-interested here, but there is a problem with these organizations more broadly. I mean, what do you make of this? Is there a there? Is the platonic ideal of an investigation like this, of a committee like this, a net good for America?
Well, actually, yes, because government oversight of itself, government making sure that it's working well and working in a just and fair way is an important thing. During the 1970s, the Church Committee that was led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, himself a former military intelligence officer, a longtime senator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, someone very qualified to do this, a bipartisan committee that was looking at serious violations by the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, et cetera, during the 1960s. That was important. So the inherent idea, as you said, the platonic ideal of a committee on government oversight is not of itself a bad thing. The problem is that that's not who these people are. Jim Jordan, I'm sorry, he's a partisan hack. This is a man who himself was deemed by the January 6th committee to be a quote-unquote significant player in the Trump administration effort to overthrow the election. This is not someone who should even be on a committee like this, much less leading it. So I think of this particular one as a revenge committee. Even calling it the weaponization of the government, that means you've already concluded that the government was weaponized. He said that it's not the role of government. In that quote that you just read, he said it's not the role of government to go after its citizens. Well, actually, it is the role of the Justice Department to go after people who are breaking the law. So if in fact they find any overreach, then fine, but I have deep suspicions about the motives and the intention of this committee, like I said, as evidenced by the fact they're already naming it a committee on the weaponization of government.
Yeah, certainly we're hearing a lot of criticisms of these ideas from many mainstream Democrats, mainstream media people. I mean, I do think it's interesting that the kind of normal Democratic consensus has very much defaulted to a kind of defense of the state and of these agencies when, I mean, progressives, for a long time were known for speaking out against various abuses, the FBI spying on, recording JFK or sending threatening messages to Martin Luther King. These are institutions with kind of sordid histories from both a libertarian and from a progressive standpoint. And now it's really, MSNBC and CNN are full of commentators who are former law enforcement, former federal agents, and it's really oh yeah, these are the smart good guys in charge. They're the good guys, and then Republicans think they're the bad guys because they think they're targeting Republicans. I absolutely agree with you that it's very partisan, but it's a little partisan both ways because Democrats have become so deferential, I think, to these authorities when they weren't necessarily always that way, or at least progressives weren't.
Right. They're deferential to them when, in fact, we're in power. So this is the point. You make a very good point. A healthy skepticism about overreach by government should be part of good citizenship. All of us, whether we're on the right or the left, should be concerned, are they going too far? Because they have been known to go too far in both directions. So you're right. We should not be arguing in a kind of childish tit-for-tat way. We should be arguing for principle. And the principle is, as you say, the very idea of government oversight of these agencies is not of itself bad. What's bad here is the obvious partisanship and the obvious revenge factor and the obvious fact that they've already concluded that the government was being weaponized. So you're correct. Our political argument should be based on principle, not on personality and not on party alone.
I mean, I do think that this is exactly why some months ago, when this conversation about whether or not the FBI should be defunded, that was instigated by far-right figures that I have no substantive policy agreement with, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. When that started percolating and there was this kind of novel, relatively novel interest in that effort among conservatives, I said this is an opportunity for liberals to actually own this conversation and put their imprint on, for them to design what they think a good faith investigation into these legitimate issues would actually look like. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and now we have a committee completely by Republican design. And I do think it leaves liberals a little bit flat-footed to say, well, they're just doing it in bad faith, when there hasn't been any commensurate effort, it seems, at least not in recent history, for the left wing of the political sphere in this country to actually right this particular ship. It does, I think, as Robbie says, give the public appearance of Republicans being concerned about these kinds of security state overreaches, while liberals are interested in protecting them no matter what. I mean, what do you think the Democrats or the broad left should be doing to try to reclaim authority? I think not just in this area, but in several other areas of the right seems to have been able to own, including issues relating to free speech, for example, which have somehow become coded in the public sphere as conservative domain.
Well, first of all, I agree with both of you. There's an intellectual laziness that has set into the political argument. We treat it like a football game, your team versus my team. The only team we should all be deeply interested in is the U.S. Constitution and the American system of democracy. That's what we should be fighting for all the time, struggling to defend. And as both of you have said, sometimes it's the Republicans, sometimes it's the Democrats. We should be concerned, we should be talking about this in terms of reforming the police, in terms of obvious cases of police brutality, in terms of such things as what happened down in Atlanta with the shooting of environmental protesters. That's where those of us on the left should be very, very concerned about overreach by government, situations such as that. So once again, the very idea of holding government accountable, that of itself is inherently fine. All of us need to remember that it's the principle that we are defending. And there are times when the government overreach that we're concerned about on the left has to do with things like censorship, has to do with decisions for foreign policy being dictated too much by the defense industry, things like our food policies being too dictated to by big food and big agriculture, the fact that there are pesticides that there are chemicals in pesticides that harm a child's brain because of policy being dictated to by chemical companies, the fact that there are too many guns on the street because our policy is dictated to by gun manufacturers, fossil fuel extraction because our policy is dictated to by big oil, the fact we don't have universal health care because our policies are dictated to by insurance companies, and people in America are flying to Canada and to Mexico to get insulin that they can't afford here because the policy is dictated to by big pharma. There are plenty of places where we should be concerned about the government being handmaiden to the forces that hurt us, treat us unjustly, rather than being advocates for the American people.
Well, meanwhile, House Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy has responded to questioning over the removal of Democrats Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell from the Intelligence Committee. Let's watch that.
Let's answer her question. You just raised a question. I'm going to be very clear with you. The Intel Committee is different. You know why? Because what happens in the Intel Committee, you don't know. What happens in the Intel Committee, although the secrets are going on in the world, other members of Congress don't know. What did Adam Schiff do as the chairman of the Intel Committee? What Adam Schiff did, use his power as a chairman and lie to the American public. Even the Inspector General said it. When Devin Nunes put out a memo, he said it was false. When we had a laptop, he used it before an election to be politics and say that it was false and said it was the Russians. When he knew different, when he knew the intel, if you talk to John Radcliffe, DNI, He came out ahead of time and says there's no intel to prove that, and he used his position as chairman, knowing he has information the rest of America does not, and lied to the American public. When a whistleblower came forward, he said he did not know the individual, even though his staff had met with him and set it up. So no, he does not have a right to sit on that. But I will not be like Democrats and play politics with these, where they removed Republicans from committees and all committees. So yes, he can serve on a committee, but he will not serve on intel, because it goes to the national security of America. And I will always put them first, all right? And if you want to talk about Swalwell, let's talk about Swalwell, because you have not had the briefing that I had. I had the briefing and Nancy Pelosi had the briefing from the FBI. The FBI never came before this Congress to tell the leadership of this Congress that Eric Swalwell had a problem with a Chinese spy until he served on intel. So it wasn't just us who were concerned about it. The FBI was concerned about putting a member of Congress on the intel committee that has the rights to see things that others don't because of his knowledge and relationship with a Chinese spy.
Do you think how McCarthy handled Schiff and Swalwell is just revenge, or was there a policy reason to do it, maybe more so, I think, in the case of Swalwell?
We all need to grow up here. The Republicans won the House. He's a Republican Speaker of the House. I don't agree with Kevin McCarthy on pretty much anything, but he is the Speaker of the House now. So on this one, Democrats remove people. On the January 6th committee, they said, no, we're not going to have certain people. We knew we're just going to be there to defend Donald Trump. So some of that, I disagree with him entirely, but it's not like with the quote-unquote weaponization select committee. He's the Speaker of the House. I don't agree with him. We need to make sure that the Democrats win back the House in 2 years, but we all need to grow up and realize they won this election.
Well, Marianne, you recently announced an exploratory committee to research whether or not you want to launch a presidential run in 2024. The left community obviously was really galvanized around a 2016 and then 2020 Bernie run, and it looks like there are not a lot of other people, if any other people at all, in the left who are willing to run. Bernie has said specifically that he's not going to run if Biden is in the race, and all indications thus far are that Biden is going to run, which means establishment figures are inclined to clear out. So many people on the left are wondering about the decision to run within the Democratic Party, given what has happened to Bernie in 2020 and 2016, as opposed to running as a third-party or independent candidate. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision-making, and whether that's part of your exploration at this point?
Well, as I've often said, I think everybody should do what their heart leads them to do. So I don't have any judgment of people who say, no, we just have to build up third-party voices. Each of us has to follow our own gut. I have perhaps a kind of nostalgic relationship to a Democratic Party of FDR, although I realize Franklin Roosevelt would probably be seen as too left-wing by the current Democratic establishment today. You know, it's important for us to remember that democracy is what matters, not political parties. Political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution. George Washington warned us about them. John Adams said that he thought that they were the biggest threat to democracy. And the reason George Washington warned us about them was exactly what we're talking about here today. He said people would become more loyal to their factions than to their country. So right now, we all know, for the reason you just talked about, the suppression, the obvious suppression of Bernie Sanders' campaign, we know what the DNC does. We know too often there has been the suppression of the wider array of voices within the Democratic Party. To me, that's a reason to go there. If I run, clearly, there are forces within the Democratic Party who will be trying to invisibilize me. I think they would have an easier time invisibilizing me if I run third party. If I do run, and I run as a Democrat, I will be more inconvenient to the people who need to be inconvenienced. You know, when I was younger, Eugene McCarthy primaried LBJ, and Bobby Kennedy primaried LBJ. Now the DNC says this is why nobody can primary an incumbent Democratic president, because when it happens, we lose. Excuse me, they killed Bobby Kennedy. So the correlation there should not be seen as causation. And then they use the Teddy Kennedy example as well. This goes back to everything we were talking about earlier. It should be about the democratic process. It should be about voices. Why are the American people offered 7 brands of toothpaste, if not more, but only 2 brands of political candidate. This operational, almost like, we will do this. You will not primary Biden. I'm not one of them. I'm not part of that machine. I think the American people deserve to have, as an option, as wide an array of possibilities in terms of the consciousness of a candidate, how the candidate is analyzing what is happening in our country today, what that candidate would do to change those things and to effectuate those things. It should not be about the DNC. It should be about democracy and the American people hearing what options lie before them.
So it sounds like you're saying you would be willing to primary Joe Biden.
Any American should be willing to primary any president that they think could be improved upon, if they feel that that presidential administration could be improved upon.
Well, Marianne, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
More Rising right after these messages.